Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm joined by Eric Trexler once again, this time solo, which I'm excited to talk to you solo. It's been a while since we've just had a one-on-one time, and I love talking to Eric because, I just think you do a great job, particularly on podcasts. I think there are some people that are just made for podcasting. I'd say luckily a lot of them who I bring on are, and I'd say particularly for you, Eric, you just do a very good job of speaking very clearly but also kind of keep it interactive and not just like someone switches off. So I appreciate you taking the time to come on.
I'm going to choose to interpret that as a compliment. There's I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase that somebody has a face for the radio. So I assume that that's not what you meant, but no, I really appreciate that. I appreciate you having me on, and it is nice to be on without having somebody to argue against. I feel like the last couple episodes I've been on, it's been like, a versus type situation. So yeah, it's nice to catch up and chat here.
No, for sure. They draw the crowds though. And I hope, at least when I, like we were just talking about the one you were on with Jeff and Menno and everyone was on that podcast. And when I do them on here, I hope that maybe the people involved take something away new, and at least the listeners understand both parties' position a lot better than when you see scraps over the internet. Although I can see it being tiring from your end for multiple reasons.
Well, no, it's great. So I'm by nature like very non-confrontational. I don't enjoy, going back and forth. I'm usually just like, okay, I've got my understanding of it. It works for me. I'm comfortable with people disagreeing with that. I don't have that innate sense where I have to win someone over to my position if I feel confident enough in my position. But I do think it's great for getting new insight. When somebody pushes back on your perspective, you have to think with a different perspective and develop a more nuanced understanding of your perspective. And I also think it's great for listeners, because listeners might hear somebody talking about a topic that they're skeptical about. And as they're listening, they think, oh, if only I could be in the room, I would ask this question, because I think their idea is incomplete. And when you've got a debate, someone is there to hopefully ask those questions that you are thinking of as you listen. So I think it's a great way to set up certain topics and episodes. But yeah, given my non-confrontational nature, it's nice to just get on and chat.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm the same. In fact, confrontation probably caused me too much stress to be able to even voice my points well enough. So you do a good job of at least it not stressing you out completely, or not enough so that you can't keep your kind of words together and make point or a sense of what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I was out of interest, and you can kind of say pass on this because I didn't give you any forewarning, and I've kind of just led this out of just randomly because
this episode's a trap.
Some episodes I just like to talk to the guests, and just I think for a lot of the people I talk to, people are interested in them as a person as well. I think a lot of the listeners like the science, they like applying it, but also it's nice sometimes to get that refreshing kind of voice of what that person on the other end, the scientist or the researcher who delves into these things, what are they doing? And I know you have competed in bodybuilding. Many of the listeners might not be aware. I think you're probably better known for all the work that you do within research and things, which I don't know how that kind of is for you. But what are you up to, like training nutrition wise? I was just thinking it today. I was like, I'm going to ask.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. I'd much prefer to be known for the work I do and the content I put out than my bodybuilding. I am technically a pro. But I'm like that person who has to be shredded to even look like they're not out of place on the pro stage. I'm not, a bigger natural competitor. So yeah, when you fill that role in natural bodybuilding where you're small for a natural bodybuilder, the last thing that you'd want is for everyone to say, he's really just a physique. The content stuff is fine, but really I'm here for the physique, because it's not much to look at. So yeah, I love putting more emphasis on the content. I think I'm a better content creator and scientist than I am a bodybuilder. So that's kind of why my emphasis lies there. In terms of my own training and nutrition, I've really been focusing, like during COVID lockdowns and isolation and stuff, I've really been focusing a lot more on doing a lot of content, a lot of writing, working on some big projects. working on some research. Training has really kind of fallen down the priority list just because I actually haven't stepped foot in a gym for, I think, 13 or 14 months at this point. Greg's got a home gym. I'll get in there every now and then to do some stuff. I've got some bands hanging on the railing beside me there, but it's been fine. I've just been focusing on other things. I've gotten really into Buddhism, which is sweet. So I've been doing a lot of mental training. At least that's the perspective I take to it. But yeah, it's just been like focusing on different things. I feel great. My body composition hasn't gotten as bad as I expected. And I actually do plan to return to the gyms in about 3 weeks. So
cool.
I've already started my process of preparing for the hell on earth level DOMs that are coming my way. Cause I'm sure, I'm going to want to dive in there and just pick up where I left off about 14 months ago. So I've started to make sure that I'm more mindful of really beating myself up as much as I can so that I've got some of that repeated bout effect ready to go and I can acclimate right back into training.
It's very interesting to hear because, yeah, I think, I don't know. I don't think many people are probably aware of, I don't know if you've even spoke about the Buddhism over on the Strongest by Science podcast or something, but that's super interesting. Is that more from I guess, yeah, what led you to go down that route just out of interest?
I'm going to get pretty philosophical here. I haven't talked about it much on the podcast just because I like to keep the podcast relatively focused. And if I'll be honest, I'm just starting to get into it. And so I don't know enough to really talk about it in a way where I'm like, I have something to share with my audience. Here's how Buddhism works. But I got into it just because I think isolation was a really interesting experience with COVID. I think it was something that I know I had never had to deal with that level of isolation for such an extended period of time. And it's interesting because it causes you to do a lot less outside in the world and a lot more inside your own mind. And Buddhism talks a lot about our desires and how that can bring us some degree of suffering is the term they use, but it's probably not the perfect translation, but just a level of unhappiness and discontent. When we desire things that we can't currently have, that creates some conflict and some negative emotional responses that I think Buddhism has some interesting perspectives on how to work through that and how to observe that rather than getting consumed by it. So I feel like it was an interesting time to look inward when going out was pretty much off the table for certain things. So I think that's what drew me to it. And yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty interesting. And like I said, I'm just getting started. So I feel like a jackass when I talk about it because then someone asked me literally any question about it. And I'm like, oh, I haven't gotten that far yet. But yeah, I think it's pretty cool.
I can reassure you, you know more about Buddhism than me. I essentially, yeah, I have some images in mind and some general kind of just, I guess, commonalities of what people think of as Buddhism, but maybe I looked in it when I was like at school sometime, but I certainly know nothing about it. But it's very interesting because I think, a lot of the listeners will be able to relate to what you said there in terms of, I don't know where I heard it. I think it was on a podcast they were talking about, like, in prison, one of the worst things that you can give to a prisoner is like isolate them. And they can't go out. And it's like, what's everyone had? They've just been isolated from everyone else. So I can see that. Especially depending on the situation you're in, can be really tough and the type of person you are. Yeah.
And I've been, the main sources of information I've been getting this knowledge from, it's been a very secular, very contemporary approach to Buddhism. So at the surface level, you could really just say it's like, just teaching you how to regulate your emotions effectively and how to reconsider your first perspective on every thought you have. So at the most basic level, it's just like, hey, stop jumping to conclusions and like emotionally reacting every time some thought enters your head. But then you can go all the way deeper into the content and it gets really cool and philosophical. So yeah, it's interesting stuff. I've got like 5 books that are coming. They're supposed to come in like 2 days. I can't wait. And that's big. If anyone has heard me talk about books on the Stronger by Science podcast, I do not read. I can read, but I choose not to. So for me to order a book, no less 5 books, is a pretty big deal.
That's huge. That's, and then I guess I'd have to ask, is bodybuilding something that's like, I guess, still a driver for you, but is the stage something that's just not on your radar in the future?
Oh, I don't think I've earned the right to put it on my radar based on my recent training practices, but it's always there, you know? So, I
Yeah.
mean, if I want to get back on stage, of course I can. But, you know, right now, if you were to ask me to list the 10 goals that to me feel most urgent, most important, and most impactful, me getting on stage definitely isn't in the top 10 right now. And I think for anyone, and I talk to clients about this all the time. If you're thinking about, hey, let's start a prep, uh, it better be in the top 10. It probably ought to be in the top 2, I think. If you know, because I mean, you've been there, Steve. It sucks. Like there's a lot of hunger. There's a lot of, you know, you're lethargic, you're cold, you feel like crap. So like if that's not in the top 2, you're going to get to a certain point where there's enough friction in the process that you're like, what am I doing here? So yeah, it's something that I might return to. You know, I definitely love training because whether or not there's a trophy at the end of the road, I feel great. I like being strong. I like feeling, you know, I like doing positive things for my physical health. So yeah, I'll certainly be training like a bodybuilder. Whether or not I compete is just going to depend on, basically I'm going to keep an eye on that list of priorities and goals. And once it jumps into the top 2, then it's probably going to be time.
Yeah, I actually really like the way you kind of laid that out. It isn't something to get into on a whim by any means. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to cut and just extend that cut. Like I do a diet every year, and this one will just be a little bit longer, be fine.
Yeah.
It starts to become number one at a certain point where you have to give it that. Otherwise, you might not, especially for the condition that you have to achieve nowadays for stage. It's just crazy.
Especially if you don't have any muscle like me.
You're way too harsh on yourself.
It's in good fun.
Yeah.
But it's funny though, because sometimes it'll jump into your top priorities and you didn't expect it. So when I last competed, it was when I got my pro card and made my pro debut. I actually did not plan to do a prep. I was just like, oh man, I need to stop eating the way I'm eating because it's just ridiculous. It was ridiculous. So I just made some very basic dietary changes, and all this body fat just starts dropping off at this ridiculous rate. And all of a sudden I looked at the scale, I looked in the mirror, and I was like, I'm over halfway done with a prep. Like for me, a prep usually involves a loss of about 40 pounds or so. I'm like 22 pounds into this and feeling great. And I'm about to do a dissertation to finish up my PhD. This is a convenient time to do a prep. So like, I might just keep dieting and see what happens. And it went well. So like, basically it was not at the top of my priority list, but then it kind of started working its way up. And all of a sudden I was like, why shouldn't I do it? Like I only have one other thing on the horizon here. So this can be number 2 and let's do it. So yeah, you just kind of stay in the game, keep lifting, keep enjoying it. Don't force anything. And maybe I'll be on stage again. Who knows?
For sure. Awesome. No, that was good to hear about. And I guess the listeners might want to know what we actually were due to talk about. And that is something relating to bodybuilding. And that's something that was recently reviewed in Mass, which I just think it's a topic that is super interesting. My girlfriend is vegan, so she's only recently become vegan. She was vegetarian like almost her whole life. So it's something that I'm very familiar with, and she does it for kind of the ethical reasons versus everything else. And that's not really what we're going to be talking about necessarily. But you recently reviewed, well, you called it vegan diets, not the game changer for hypertrophy, but a viable alternative. And I think because veganism is becoming, something ever more popular for whatever reason. And there might be some bodybuilders who are wanting to, I don't know, utilize more of that approach, maybe go towards more of a plant-based diet. So I think this study you were particularly excited about. So I don't know if you want to start just kind of talking about what made this study different to others, and then kind of just to see where you go. And I'll pick away at some questions if that's all right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was really excited about this study. And I had to make the title. I put a little dig in there for the Game Changers thing, because on the podcast, Gamechangers was a documentary about plant-based diets, and they made so many claims, some of them funny, some of them intended to be taken seriously, few of them really rigorously presented. So I had to take a little dig, but it was really important when I discussed that documentary. Okay, there's a silly documentary about this topic, but that doesn't mean we should hold it against this topic. If you want to hold it against the producer, the director, that's fine, but it doesn't mean we should discard the viability of plant-based diets. It doesn't mean we should assume that there are no potential benefits to be enjoyed there, or at least we can, like I said in the title here, view it maybe not as a huge step up in terms of health and performance, but maybe a totally viable alternative to an omnivorous diet. And one definition to get to address right out of the gate here is I'm going to talk about plant-based diets, and I personally view them on a spectrum. So like it's not just I have a vegan diet or I don't, right? So you can view your food selection as a spectrum, and some people might be totally carnivore diet, no plant-based foods, or negligible plant-based foods. Most people just based on the numbers have some type of omnivorous diet where there's some combination of plant source foods and animal source foods. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got totally vegan diets, with no food items coming from animals. So we've got this spectrum. And when I say plant-based diets, we're talking about getting over into the ovo-lacto-vegetarian spectrum. Maybe you're a vegetarian and you just eat eggs, or you just eat dairy products, or maybe you are a vegan. So that's kind of the area of the spectrum we're talking about here. So plant-based doesn't just mean strictly vegan. You can say that certain diets are more plant-based just because they skew in that direction a little bit. So one of the reasons I was so excited about this new study was because we talk about plant versus animal-based protein sources all the time in the fitness world, the bodybuilding world. And I think generally speaking, there's a pretty solid consensus that when we look in a vacuum, a plant-based protein source is not quite as good as an animal-based protein source in most cases. So we like to look at this very mechanistic approach to what makes a protein source good or bad, as it pertains to its ability to support hypertrophy or support muscle protein synthesis. And there are a few different ways to look at that from a mechanistic perspective. From one perspective, you might not be looking at effects on muscle activity or tissue, anabolic processes whatsoever. You might simply be looking at a protein and assigning it a protein quality score. And there are different metrics. There's different ways to, there are different scoring systems to give a protein its quality score. But generally speaking, the factors that go into a protein's quality score essentially come down to, is it lacking any key essential amino acids? And how digestible is the protein? Are we actually absorbing it and getting those amino acids into the bloodstream at a reasonably prudent rate of appearance? So we can look at a protein source that way. And when we do it that way, there's really no debate to be had there. When you classify a protein based on its amino acid composition and its digestibility and its absorption kinetics, we definitely see that animal-based protein sources are higher quality than plant-based. It's very, very straightforward. Now, a different way to look at a protein's quality as it pertains to its ability to support hypertrophy is to look at how does a serving of this protein actually impact acute measurements of muscle protein synthesis? So you can imagine a scenario, we bring people into the lab, they're totally fasted, we give them 30 grams of whey protein or 30 grams of soy protein, and we look at muscle protein synthesis for a handful of hours after that protein dose. And again, in those scenarios, we generally find that animal source proteins are better than the majority of plant-based protein sources. Now, not all plant-based protein sources are the same, right? So the effects of 30 grams of soy protein are going to be different than 30 grams of wheat protein when we look in isolation, 30 grams versus 30 grams in a fasted state. And we're looking for a few hours, that kind of acute response in protein synthesis. But that's rarely what we're interested in. When we actually talk about plant-based proteins, these lab-based scenarios and these kind of theoretical protein scores based on the characteristics of the protein, these give us valuable information. I'm not discounting the work that's been done there. It's very valuable information, but it doesn't directly address the question that most of us have in mind, which is, if I started taking soy protein after my workout instead of whey, am I going to regret that? Or if I decide that I want to go from a very omnivorous diet to a slightly more plant-based approach and replace some of my animal proteins, am I going to regret that decision? Or do I have to make some degree of accommodation to account for the fact that I went from higher quality proteins to lower quality proteins? And so it's really weird. For some reason in the last few months, this area of research has been really active. One of the things that I was so excited about with my dissertation topic as a PhD student is there aren't that many areas. I mean, that's a ridiculous thing to say. Let me go back. Of course, research is always evolving, but in sports nutrition specifically, like if you want to get into creatine research, we know a good amount of what that does in terms of sport related applications. If you want to get into protein research, if studying whey protein, its effects on hypertrophy, a lot of those studies have been done. One of the things that excited me about my topic, which was citrulline and nitrate and nitric oxide precursors, was that every couple months there would be these huge papers that come out that make a huge impact on your understanding of the topic. Like, we were still in that area where during my time as a grad student, someone would say, "Hey, did you know we store nitrate in muscle?" And you're like, "What? No one told me that." This was big stuff that was happening, real paradigm altering papers that come out every couple months. And yeah, for whatever reason, people decided, I guess within the last year, to really get into a more ecologically valid mindset when it comes to comparing plant animal based protein. So for example, one of the papers that came out within the last couple months was a meta-analysis by Lim and colleagues, and they were looking at animal versus plant-based protein supplement studies. And so it was kind of one of those questions I alluded to, which, you might be asking, oh, if all I did was switch out my whey protein and use soy protein instead, how's that really going to impact my gains? So this was looking at that. It was looking at, in studies where people are just kind of consuming a fairly typical diet, if all we're doing is a supplement intervention and we're just giving them either an animal supplement or a plant-based protein supplement, are those really going to impact strength and hypertrophy to a meaningful degree, going with one or the other? And the results indicated not really. It was a good meta-analysis, which means that they looked at it from many different perspectives. So if you went into it and you really felt like arguing that animal-based protein interventions are superior, you could get there based on the various analyses presented. But you'd also have some good challenges from someone arguing the other perspective, from someone saying, when you look at the effects on, for example, just raw units, changes in lean body mass in these interventions, we're talking about a difference that favors animal proteins, but the difference is like 0.2 kilograms, and it's not significant. But then if you remove one of the studies, it becomes significant. You start getting into those types of arguments of, well, should we remove that study or this study, and the results change if we do one or the other? But ultimately, if we just leave the body of literature as it is, we're talking about 200 grams of lean body mass. So not a huge deal when we consider the practical ramifications there. So that answers, in my opinion, an interesting question, which is just looking at supplementing your diet with one versus the other. Are you that much better off with an animal protein in the context of a typical diet? It doesn't look like it. And that kind of makes sense when we consider, in an omnivorous diet, you've got plenty of essential amino acids in the bloodstream pretty much all waking hours of the day, right? We like to think of our meals as this like extremely precise process by which we increase amino acids and then they drop back down to baseline, because out of sight, out of mind. If I'm done eating, then I'm assuming my amino acids are just gone, right? But they linger. Like one of the phrases that Helms uses that I really like is he talks about it as a conga line with our meals, how they're just kind of bumping into each other when we consider digestion and absorption and blood responses and clearance from the blood. The idea that we've got these very discrete, elevation and then back to zero with amino acids, it's not a realistic way to view this stuff. And so when we consider, okay, well, you've had soy protein instead of whey in this type of intervention, you're on an omnivorous diet, you've got plenty of essential amino acids in your bloodstream, you're not critically lacking any key essential amino acid, and you got enough soy from this supplement to maximally stimulate, or you got enough leucine from the soy supplement, for example, to maximally stimulate a protein synthetic response. So you've got the leucine that you need there. You've got all the essential amino acids that you need. You should be able to have a really robust response. And so that's a very intuitive finding from my perspective. But it leaves out a key question, which, a soy protein supplement versus whey in the context of an omnivorous diet with plenty of animal proteins, that's very different from saying I'm a bodybuilder switching from an omnivorous diet, most of my proteins coming from whey, eggs, meat, and I'm switching over to a vegan diet. That is a very, very, very different intervention. And because we may not be able to have all that reassurance that we're getting all those essential amino acids from different animal source proteins in earlier meals and later meals and things like that. So again, within the last couple months, 2 huge papers came out, and I reviewed both of them in mass. So one of them was a very short term, but not as short term as some of the other studies I mentioned previously. So I talked about how we make a lot of inferences about protein quality based on that acute muscle protein synthesis response over like a few hours after a single dose in a fasted state. Well, in this case, the study was looking at muscle protein synthesis over multiple days with resistance training done on a daily basis throughout those multiple days of observation. So this is getting us a little bit closer to, we've got this kind of question of, if I look at muscle protein synthesis over 4 hours, what does that tell me about hypertrophy?
Hey, Pascal here. I just wanted to take the moment to talk about our membership site. Inside, you'll find a thriving forum, an extensive exercise library, courses, presentations, and research reviews. All I need you to do is hit the link in the description below and sign up.
I don't know. It doesn't seem to correlate that well. When we look at it over 3 or 4 days, we're getting closer to something that can more reliably predict hypertrophy. But of course, the best thing we can do is actually measure the thing we're interested in, which is hypertrophy. So this study was looking at multiple days in a row of muscle protein synthesis, which is a step in the right direction. And it was comparing a vegan diet to an omnivorous diet. And the vegan diet was getting most of its protein from mycoprotein. So it's kind of a fungus-derived non-animal protein, but it's a really nice protein source. It's got great digestibility. It's got a great composition of amino acids. Plenty of
corn. Sorry,
yes,
people would know it's maybe corn. Yeah, with the Q.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that brand name might be more recognized across the pond. I know
it's
in
quite
America.
Big here.
Yeah, I had never heard of that brand name until Greg told me about it. But yeah, so corn or mycoprotein, and so they've got these 2 different diets, and the big strength of this study was that they made sure that both groups were eating plenty of total protein. So both groups were having 1.8 grams per kilogram per day of protein, which is pretty squarely in the range that most people would say is pretty advisable. Usually people say 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram is kind of that comfortable range where we feel like we're maximizing anabolic responses to training. And so it's pretty straightforward. They over the course of this, I think it was a 3-day observation period with muscle protein synthesis, they found that as long as these groups were eating plenty of protein, they had pretty sensible distribution of the protein throughout the day. Within that context, there really didn't seem to be a huge advantage of animal protein versus this mycoprotein heavy vegan diet. So that was a really nice finding that, as we get away from the mechanistic stuff and get a little bit more applied and say, let's actually give this to people lifting weights and see what happens over several days. This was a step in the right direction of saying the differences between these, high quality and low quality proteins might not be as big as we like to think. There might be, and this comes up when we look at the time restricted feeding literature, the meal frequency literature. This comes up with the post workout protein timing literature. Just getting enough protein throughout the day and splitting it among at least a few meals seems to take care of a lot of the stuff we worry about with protein. We've seen this in many different areas of research where, time restricted feeding, are you getting enough opportunities to actually stimulate muscle protein synthesis? Well, when we have the studies where they have an 8-hour feeding window and they're eating, 1.6, 1.8 grams per kilogram per day, time restricted feeding seems to be fine for supporting strength and muscle gain. So there's something to the concept of just making sure you're getting enough total protein and getting, in my opinion, I think the evidence would say at least 3 decent servings throughout whatever your feeding window is. I would say the lowest I like to go with a feeding window is like 8 hours in most contexts if we're trying to maximize hypertrophy. And that's great. It gives you, you eat at noon, 4 p.m., 8 p.m. You get 3 great opportunities to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and you're good to go. So that study was a step in the right direction for empowering lifters to feel more comfortable adopting a vegan diet without feeling like they're sacrificing gains in the process. But the big paper, the one that you alluded to, came out even more recently. I reviewed it this past month in Mass. And this was really, in my opinion, tying it all together. So like I said, the best case scenario is we're actually measuring the thing that we're interested in, which is hypertrophy. And in this particular study, I love what they did. They got young, healthy folks to go on a vegan diet or an omnivorous diet. They did 12 weeks of resistance training, and they measured hypertrophy at several different levels, which I think is fantastic because you'd like to see some degree of agreement from level to level to level. And what I mean by that is they used DEXA to look at lean tissue of the leg. It was a lower body resistance training program. So they use DEXA to look at the whole leg, lean mass. They use ultrasound to look at the thickness of specific muscles, so the whole muscle level. And then they also looked at fiber cross-sectional area. So whether you're looking at the whole leg, the muscle itself, or the individual muscle fiber, they kind of looked at hypertrophy all those different ways. And they also looked at leg press strength as well. So the limitation of this study, just in the interest of being transparent, something that is worth considering is it wasn't a randomized controlled trial. The participants were not randomized to the group that they were assigned to. In many cases, that might be cause for concern when it comes to the validity of findings from a study. Not that they become invalid, but that we hold randomization in very high regard in research as a really, really nice feature of a study that gives us a little bit more confidence in the generalizability of its findings. In this case, they didn't randomize, and I actually don't care. I don't have a problem with it. I care enough to keep it in mind, but when you study vegan diets, it's very hard to tell somebody who's an omnivore, hey, meat is just off, any animal product, not even meat, is off the menu for you. That's a hard sell for a lot of people who are omnivores, and you can introduce issues related to people either dropping the study or just not adhering to their diet effectively. Probably the even bigger issue is you take someone who's a vegan, enroll them in your diet. They're a vegan in this scenario, we'll assume for ethical purposes. And you say, that ethical stuff that means so much to you, let's just forget about it for 12 weeks. Who cares? It's fine. A lot of people don't want to do that. And so then you have additional issues where you're trying to find people to do this study. And it becomes such a strange selection process of finding, vegans who are willing to not be vegans for 12 weeks. It's not easy to do that, So I'm actually very comfortable. What they did was they enrolled all these people. They said, hey, you're a vegan. you're going to be in the vegan group. And if you're not a vegan, you can do the omnivorous treatment group. So I had no issues with that. Both diets, once again, had plenty of protein, 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. And the vegan group, a large percentage of their protein, I mentioned the previous study, they were getting a ton of protein from corn or mycoprotein. In this study, they were getting a ton of protein from soy-based supplements. And so that's important to keep in mind, because it's not like they're just eating a bunch of wheat protein, which is generally regarded as pretty low quality, doesn't have a very good digestibility score, doesn't have very good amino acid composition. I'm talking about soy protein, which is a pretty good plant-based protein. But in any case, what they found with this study is over this 12-week intervention, there was really no inherent advantage to being on the omnivorous diet relative to the vegan diet. So whichever way you want to look at it, changes in leg press, changes in all those different levels of hypertrophy. The both groups, a technical interpretation of the stats is that they were not significantly different from one another, but just looking at the mean changes, looking at the way the data are distributed, you could say in a non-statistical sense that they are quite similar to each other. I always get careful about that because there are statistical tests to test equivalence. So I always like to separate, like I'm not saying they're statistically equivalent. I'm just saying these means are pretty damn close to each other. And to me, that can be pretty telling. So in this study, like I said, very equivalent outcomes. And this is nice. I mean, 12 weeks looking at all these different measurements of hypertrophy and strength. I think these findings are really helpful and useful. But something to keep in mind here, and I think this is critically important, they distributed their protein very sensibly, and they had a really nice protein source making up the bulk of this vegan diet. And so what that means is when you look at the meal by meal breakdown in this study, the vegan diet on 4 occasions every day was providing at least 0.3 grams per kilogram of protein in a meal. And most studies will suggest if you really want to maximize muscle protein synthesis as a young person in response to a meal, you want to have at least like 0.24 grams per kilogram in that meal. And you'd like to have somewhere around 2 or 3 grams of leucine or more. Those are usually the numbers you shoot for. When you look at this vegan diet meal by meal throughout the day, you see on 4 different occasions spread throughout the day over that threshold of protein per meal and somewhere around 2 to 3 grams of leucine. So they had their bases covered in terms of making sure they were getting enough protein, enough leucine, and distributing that pretty sensibly throughout the day. And so based on these findings, based on this whole kind of collection, these 3 studies that have come out the last couple months, I'm really warming up to the idea of treating vegan diets as a fully viable alternative to omnivorous diets in terms of supporting hypertrophy and supporting a variety of training goals. But there are big caveats to keep in mind. I think without question, you need to make sure your total protein is high enough if you want to have a vegan diet that supports hypertrophy to a maximal degree. I think you might want to be very cognizant about what is your main protein sources in your diet. So if you have a vegan diet that's heavily based on corn or mycoprotein and soy, I think that's going to look potentially very different from a diet that's mostly corn and wheat protein, for example. So you want to make sure that you've got your bases covered in terms of, do my protein sources actually provide a comprehensive mixture of essential amino acids and leucine? Am I getting what I need? And I would say if you really want to be extra cautious, within a given meal, you probably don't want a huge glaring lack of a particular amino acid. Now, you might still have plenty of it in your bloodstream from a previous meal, but if you really want to get down to maximizing the efficacy of this approach and making sure that you're just not doubting the approach, feeling like you really have your bases covered, I'd say you might want to be mindful of getting at least 3, maybe 4 or even 5 solid servings of protein per day, making sure you've got a nice comprehensive mix of amino acids at those meals, and make sure that you're getting all the essential amino acids and the leucine that you need. So I think overall, this is a good reminder, in my opinion, that we have to be really cautious about taking mechanistic findings and necessarily extrapolating them to real world scenarios and assuming that there are no other complicating factors that might influence what we're looking at. So with protein, it's fascinating because we've seen some of this mechanistic research, right? Where we'll look at, you consume protein, muscle protein synthesis goes up for a fixed amount of time. It falls despite the fact that amino acid levels in the blood are elevated. And there's this refractory period. And a lot of the evidence that we have for that is very controlled scenarios where people come into the lab totally fasted, no prior resistance training, and they have a relatively small amount of protein per these doses. So you have a lot of questions when you say, well, what happens if I ate breakfast, then trained, and then had, 2 grams per kilogram per day of protein? Does that specific timing related to that refractory period really matter all that much? So it's an area of debate where some people say, let's take this mechanistic finding and assume it pans out perfectly. But then we look at some of the time restricted feeding studies where people are eating plenty of protein and lifting, and some of those little nuanced mechanistic differences, they seem to kind of come out in the wash. It doesn't mean they don't matter at all, but they have a small enough impact that they don't seem to really be driving the results of these more applied studies. And that's important to keep in mind. So, yeah, I think that's kind of my updated assessment of a vegan diet, it being a very viable alternative, but you still want to be mindful of, what are my actual protein sources? Because not all, with animal-based protein sources, I think one way to phrase it is it's just easier. So it takes out all the thought, because if you're eating a bunch of eggs and fish and meat and dairy, you're fine with your amino acids. You don't have to take that extra step of saying like, oh, none of my protein sources have methionine. I feel like that's a problem, because it is. With animal-based protein interventions, you don't have to take that extra step of worrying about digestibility. Which essential amino acid am I lacking? Because none of them. You're good with an animal-based protein. You're going to have very good digestibility and an excellent amino acid profile. These vegan approaches to replacing animal-based proteins are viable. They just require a little extra step of thought and planning. But if implemented well, I see no reason why they would necessarily hold somebody back.
I think that was more than I actually even expected. So you went over actually a lot of the studies recently that you reviewed in mass, not just this recent one, which is great to get that backstory actually and hear about everywhere it's come from and kind of talking about that mechanistic data and explaining even, some of the unquestioned kind of, the questions we have that are unanswered in terms of like people talk about like the protein full effect and the refractory periods and things like this. And it's kind of like, but it is kind of counter towards other evidence that we've got. So we kind of have that general recommendation that we don't even know is necessarily a must, but we know hitting your protein at the end of the day is a must. And something that I think was great that you said there was, it wasn't just like a vegan can just match their protein and just spread it through the day and they're fine. They do have to think about it. So where, I don't know, you and me, I actually don't know how you eat, but if we're assuming you're an omnivore, you're having like your eggs, they might have to look at, and they can have some pea and maybe some wheat and or rice rather. That's the one, pea and rice. And they might have to try and think about, okay, what's the equivalent of what I'm replacing here? Like you said, it's just going to require a lot more thought. And I think that's what initially put me off, at least whenever I was thinking about doing these things. And of course, it's not quite the same when you just from a preferences point of view, kind of trying to get these things. But I know there's even companies now that are producing like vegan made protein powders that do have, I think I saw Eric Helms did a review of kind of veganism within the mass research reviews as well. And he talked about kind of these companies that are producing this protein powder that's like pea and rice. And there was a study on it and how it was equivocal almost to whey protein as well. So at least, like you said, the spectrum there I think is really cool because people don't necessarily have to be all the way in. But if they want to try going further that way, for whatever reason, they can start doing it without the worries as much as a lot of us kind of very anxious bodybuilders about our muscle and our food.
Yeah, one additional consideration that I think is really important to highlight is, this vegan approach to eating. We can deal with some of the shortcomings of the proteins just by some planning, right? Like I said, just kind of matching things up really well, choosing higher quality sources. And there's a fantastic review by Van Vliet and colleagues that goes through a lot of different common protein sources, plant-based protein sources, and compares, which ones have the most leucine, which have the most lysine, the most methionine. So it's a really helpful resource. So that's one part of the equation. Another thing, though, is that with a vegan diet, and this is if we're going all the way to vegan, there are going to be some micronutrients that we have to be extra mindful of. Anytime that you're cutting food groups out of a diet, that's pretty much a red flag that you might want to check and make sure that there's not something that you're forgetting. And when we go to a fully vegan diet, we find that we lose some common food sources of some key micronutrients, and we can replace them with vegan food sources, but the bioavailability might not be equivalent. So we have to be extra mindful of getting in things like iron, B12, calcium, things like that. And that was actually one of the interesting things was this most recent study, that the 12-week longitudinal intervention that actually measured hypertrophy. At baseline, they did notice some, because they weren't randomized groups. They could compare habitual vegans to habitual omnivores. There were some differences that I consider noteworthy when looking at their baseline blood levels of ferritin, B12, and vitamin D. So that was kind of it highlighted a key consideration for vegan diets, that we need to be mindful of some of these micronutrients, but it also kind of served as an internal check. Like, yeah, you're a vegan group. They were really vegan. And we've got like the blood levels to show it. So that's something you want to be mindful of, is when making a transition to a fully plant-based diet, it's not just protein. There's also some micronutrient considerations. And as you mentioned, Steve, you don't necessarily have to go all the way when you make this kind of change. And one of the ways that Helms has talked about it in the past is kind of like your carbon footprint. Like you can be a little bit more mindful of your impact on the environment without saying like, I will never use anything involving carbon again, right? You don't have to like swear off of all methods of transportation in order to be to be more mindful of your environmental impact. And so one of the things that you'll run into with a purely vegan approach, if you're trying to prep for a bodybuilding show, and you're trying to get 2, maybe even up to 2.5 grams per kilogram per day of protein, and you're trying to keep your carbs low, I don't know how you're going to do it without eating a diet that is almost all supplements. Like it gets very, very, very difficult, because when you look at the typical plant-based protein sources, aside from, dietary supplements and powders, a lot of these whole food sources of protein carry a lot of carbohydrate with them. So I think a vegan diet where you're trying to get plenty of protein in, it tends to be a pretty high carb diet in most cases, or you're eating a ton of nuts and seeds, in which case you're going to have a lot of fat intake. But it becomes very difficult to achieve these very high protein intakes while also keeping carbs and fats low. So like I know Helms has talked about, he kind of gravitates toward more animal-based protein sources as he gets lower and lower and lower with calories, basically out of necessity. So even if you are like, I can't really go all the way in all stages of dieting, it's something that can be adapted. There's some flexibility there, but one thing worth pointing out is that if you're on an ovo-lacto vegetarian diet, so you're not vegan, you eat egg products and dairy products, you're fine even throughout prep. I mean, you've got whey protein, you've got fat-free Greek yogurt, you've got egg whites, you've got plenty of options there. But a very low calorie, high protein vegan diet, that's going to require a great deal of effort.
Hi guys, Steve here. Just wanted to take a moment of your time to remind you of our online coaching service. At Revive Stronger, we pride ourselves on providing personalized service that will take your physique and knowledge to the next level. If you're interested, check the description and sign up.
And do you think in any case, you talked about kind of the micronutrient deficiencies, and I guess it could be your take on getting blood work semi-regularly anyway for kind of natural competitors, or I say natural competitors because it's enhanced guys should be getting that more regularly, at least from what I've seen, seems to be quite important. But for natural competitors, do you see that as something that's just like prudent, especially if you're starting to exclude food groups to try to see where you are with various levels?
I mean, there's certainly no downside aside from
The needle,
the needle cost, practicality. Although I think you guys have a functioning healthcare system over there, so I don't know how the price factors into it, but yeah, in America, I've been conditioned to just never get healthcare. That's not a recommendation, but it can be so expensive. It's crazy, but no, I mean, of course, it would be prudent whenever you're on any kind of super restrictive diet, a diet that cuts out food groups, or just a very, very low calorie diet. Having that blood work can be very informative. I remember one time, even if you don't want to proactively do regular blood work, just a more mindful monitoring of how you feel and subjectively, like if you're starting to feel very, very, very lethargic and you're like, I wonder if maybe I should check my blood iron levels. I know for me personally, as a natural bodybuilder, I started feeling different, and I was like, this would make sense if I have like no testosterone in my body, but otherwise it might be a medical issue. And so I go to the doctor. I'm like, can you just make sure I don't have any testosterone right now? Because otherwise I feel like there's something going on. And they're like, yeah, dude, you don't have any. And I'm like, perfect. Because like, that's just how it goes. Like, I think I was like 6 weeks out, 8 weeks out. I was lean, but still getting leaner, low calorie diet. And I was just like, yeah, I don't have any testosterone. So in that case, the blood work was confirmatory, just like, let's go make sure that the changes I'm feeling in terms of mood state, energy level, all these other things, let's make sure that there's at least an identified cause here. And then of course, if you go to the doctor and you're like, I'm feeling lethargic and, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, they might look at your blood levels and say, okay, well, we're noticing some low vitamin D, some low iron, whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. And so then they can put you on, a sensible protocol to alleviate those issues. So I think, of course, it's always prudent. I mean, that's like a good blanket recommendation for literally anybody, is just keep an eye on your blood work in perpetuity. But certainly, if you're not willing to do that, I would encourage people to just be really mindful of how they're feeling. And if they feel any, if they have a subjective change in their energy level, their mood state, the way they feel, in those cases, it's probably not a bad idea to go check it out.
The only other thing I was thinking is, I imagine you've coached vegans, and I have a few, and I'm always shocked by how high their fiber sometimes goes. Yeah. And that, surprisingly, at least in my experience with my people that I've worked with, they seem to just be able to tolerate it. But I imagine as someone going that way, as a bodybuilder trying to mass or something, you're like, suddenly I'm like, oh, I've heard the Revive Stronger podcast with Eric, I'm going to switch to all vegan sources. And suddenly I know even the mycoprotein has a bunch of fiber in there if you go to beans and lentils. Yeah, it really starts adding up. So I guess, do you think that's something people should at least be aware of to maybe taper into it a little bit? Or
yeah, I mean, it's definitely something to be aware of. You might also notice that your hunger management and satiety feels a little bit different if you do like a immediate switch and just completely change up your food sources. I have heard of that. The fiber intake is a notable change. Anytime you look at these interventions, the vegan diet is going to have way higher fiber intake, but it does, for whatever reason, seem to be pretty well tolerated in most cases. I don't necessarily have a great explanation for that, but it's something to be mindful of. And what the way I approach fiber for all clients and for myself, whether we're talking vegan diet, omnivorous diet, whatever, is I think most people have a range of fiber intakes within which they can really comfortably operate. And so, like, if your fiber starts getting lower than is right for you, you'll often find issues with hunger and satiety management. You'll often find issues with stool consistency. And that's not a talk that any coach loves having, but let's talk about the consistency of your stool. So with low fiber, it starts to become apparent when you're below the range that's going to work best for you. Conversely, when you start going above the range that's going to work best for you, you tend to notice feeling really gassy, really bloated, just generally uncomfortable. There are some very clear indicators from your digestion that we're probably above the range we're looking for. So you want to make sure that you're being mindful of that and settling into your ideal range. And some of those changes are pretty easy to make. What you can do is look at, well, what are my carb sources as a vegan dieter that are not meaningfully contributing to my protein intake? How can I potentially swap those out to reduce my fiber intake? Yeah. So there are some easy substitutions you can make to alleviate that. But some people who are really sensitive to high fiber intakes, they might notice that just from their protein sources, in order to get enough protein on this diet, the fiber is just too high and it just doesn't work for them. It's just not a comfortable way of living. And that of course is unfortunate, because usually they're making this change for a specific reason. They're usually enthusiastic about it. And so then you have to have some conversations. Okay, what do we do here? We could maybe lean more on protein supplementation, which is a viable route. We don't want to be getting all of our protein from supplements for a variety of different reasons, but we could lean maybe more on that. Or, maybe we take an approach like some of these studies where they say, well, it's not necessarily supplementation, but let's get more soy-based products into the diet that have low fiber, something like that. Another thing is thinking outside the box a little bit. So let's say that you're on a vegan diet for ethical reasons, and it's purely in the interest of animal welfare and environmental purposes. Depending on where you live, depending on your area and the resources available to you, you might be able to find a creative solution, such as there might be an egg farmer 15 minutes away. And so if you're supplementing your vegan diet with eggs from a local farmer who you can go drive by and make sure the chickens are happy. I think for a lot of people I've seen a lot of instances where people on vegan diets are very comfortable consuming eggs because they have the ability to make sure that animal welfare is being respected where they're getting their eggs from. So you can think outside the box and lean more on supplements or some non-conventional ways to get protein sources into the diet without sacrificing anything that's important to you with regards to whatever reason, that you've opted for a vegan diet.
Very well said. And the final question I have on this is, I think when anyone hears soy and they're a bodybuilder, particularly males, I guess, it's probably more important for males, their kind of ears prick and they kind of shiver a little bit. They're like, soy, I'm not sure about it. I don't know how much you've kind of looked into soy. What are the is there a certain amount we should restrict ourselves to in terms of the impact on testosterone or estrogen?
Yeah, I've looked into it enough to kind of form an opinion. So there was a great study by Mike Roberts' lab. I know Cody Hahn was on the paper. I forget if Cody was the lead author or not, but they were looking at the effects of soy protein supplements and whey protein supplements, some other supplements, looking at the effects on estrogen-related signaling and testosterone-related signaling, estrogenic anabolic outcomes or androgenic outcomes. And within the range they were studying, nothing looked too bad from the estrogen or from the soy intervention. And I think they were given maybe 60 to 80 grams of soy per day in part of the study. I could be off on that, but I do remember seeing that the soy protein intake at phases of the study was pretty high. And, for example, in this study here, the vegan longitudinal study, if you're worried about how it might impact your ability to achieve hypertrophy or something like that, then, these subjects were consuming 58 grams a day of supplementary soy protein, and anabolic processes seem to be working just fine for them. But of course, a lot of people are worried about secondary things that are unrelated to anabolic processes. I feel pretty comfortable with soy protein There's some debate at very high intakes. A lot of the concern about soy comes from some case reports where people are consuming a tremendous amount of soy protein each day. I don't even think twice about it. If you're talking about consuming 40, 60, 80 grams of soy protein per day, I really don't think twice about it. I don't tend to go higher than that just because of the unknown unknowns. You know, like I don't have enough data to alleviate my concerns of what happens when you have 120 grams of soy protein per day. It's probably fine, but I don't have enough empirical data to say I'm very confident that it's totally fine. So I usually tell people there's no reason that soy can't be a major contributor to your daily protein intake, but maybe you don't want to go 100% soy. So
Cool.
I like to limit soy protein intake down to like 60 or 80 grams per day as my top end, and then work other sources in from there. And one of the really nice things is, so Steve, you remember gluten-free diets got really big, right? And there was the whole concept of non-celiac gluten sensitivity and things like that. And so I remember talking to people who had celiac disease, and they're like, well, I'm slightly annoyed that everybody's like now, you know, oh yeah, me too. Because this is like a thing that's not just like some trivial diet fad for me. This is like a thing that's impacted my life in a major way. But they were also quite pleased because they're like, dude, I've never had this many gluten-free food options that are palatable and affordable and accessible. And so I think one of the nice things with this new interest, this revived interest in vegan diets is, you know, it used to be if you wanted to get a vegan supplement, it's like, okay, what kind of soy do you want? You know, I mean, that was pretty much it. And now, as you mentioned previously, we're getting all these different blends that are coming out with hemp seed and pumpkin seed and rice and peas. And I mean, there are a lot of options out there. Corn has a really extensive product line of imitating anything you'd wish to imitate. So yeah, I think soy absolutely can be a major contributor to your protein intake. But if you want to err on the side of caution, I'd say I probably just wouldn't go above what I witnessed in that study I mentioned by Han and colleagues over in Mike Roberts' lab. And I want to say that the top end of their soy intervention was around 60 to 80 grams. I might be completely off on that, but that's a number that feels good to me by memory.
Cool. No, I think that's awesome to hear, because I think a lot of people would be a bit put off by it. And I know a lot of some of the vegan products are quite heavily soy based because it's, I don't know, I guess it's versatile in many ways. But like you said, there are like a variety of different things we can rely on. I guess as ones you mentioned, we got like soy, you have the combined rice and pea, and then you have the mycoprotein. Even that's 3 different ones right there. And I mean, I don't know how many different meat products people eat every day, but they're probably not having much more than 3 anyway. So if you were just to rotate one in and out here and there, that's already quite cool. So yeah.
I have a fact check on the fly, because when I come on the podcast, I want to give you the best possible content, Steve. So the paper was, Cody Hahn was the first author, and the title was Soy Protein Supplementation is Not Androgenic or Estrogenic in College-Aged Men when Combined with Resistance Training. I think at some phases of the intervention, they were consuming about 39 grams a day from soy protein. At some phases, they doubled the dose and had 78.4 grams per day, or it might have been like a subset consuming one or the other. But in any case, they provided pretty good evidence that up to that number, about 80 grams per day, was totally fine, which is pretty much where I set my upper limit. And like I said, this other study, they were consuming about 60 grams a day. They didn't look at all these other estrogenic outcomes, but everybody was okay.
Awesome. Eric, thank you so much for super comprehensive chat around this topic. And I'm excited because I don't think I've ever really talked to anyone in any sort of depth around it. And like I said, it's becoming more and more popular. So hopefully some people have got some food for thought for sure. And I want to make sure if people want to catch up, see what you're doing when you get back into the gym, maybe you'll start, I don't know, showing off your lifts or something. I don't know if people now DM you and they're like, I want to see you lifting, Eric. Let me see Eric. But anyway, where should they reach out to you?
So you can find me at strongerbyscience.com. We've got articles, we've got the podcast, and there's also the link to MASS, which is our research review every month. outside of that, you can find me on Instagram. That's really the only place that I'm super active on social media. Well, that's where I exist on social media, I guess. I'm not super active anywhere. But you can find me there, and my handle is @Trexler Fitness.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, we mentioned Mass several times. We're proud affiliates, have been since launch, and it's such a great resource for this sort of thing. And you can just you can dig and choose and search. It's great as like someone who's interested in it, or a coach for finding about anything. Actually, it's great.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and it's fun because I'm noticing more than ever I have continuity in my Mass articles. I've been getting into protein a lot lately, and the articles kind of build month over month. It's fun to see as this new, and we only cover new evidence. So it's not like we plan out some storyboarded narrative. Oh, we're going to build this over 6 months. But as this new research comes out, you fold it into your previous understanding, and you start to snowball this understanding. And yeah, I mean, the line of research looking at protein distribution, protein timing, and plant-based protein sources and protein quality, it's all converging really smoothly right now, which is a nice thing to see. You know, it can be so frustrating when you see research that seems to be contradictory and you just can't work out these contradictions. But when we look at, you know, the improvements going from 2 high protein meals a day to 3, and then the plateau beyond 3, and how that fits in with a time-restricted feeding research, and how that fits in with the way that these vegan diets are designed, it's a really beautiful thing. So, yeah, if you join in on Mass, you can watch this stuff develop in real time, and not just appreciate the conclusion afterward, but watch it all get kind of incorporated as the research comes out. It's a fun experience.
For sure. So, guys, that will all be linked in the description box below, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks again, Eric.
Thank you.
So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Flor. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people, but each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics. Discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
The exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy, we're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge, and I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.